What's up, U.S. history people? This is Mr. Norris.
And Mr. Lawrence.
And we have video number 5 for you, Nationalism and Sectionalism. This one is titled The Failure of Compromises. And it looks like Henry Clay may have failed the nation, Mr. Lawrence. What do you think?
Looks like it.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. All right, so problems begin to develop. The key idea is as the U.S. begins to expand westward, that is called manifest destiny, going from the Atlantic to the Pacific. As this happens, there's going to be debates over slavery because the question will be, will this land be free or will it be slave?
All right, so what are the North and the South's views on slavery? So this is just a broad generalization that we're going to be talking about for this course. Most northern states will consider themselves to be anti-slavery states or free states. And also we'll see the strongest really pockets of abolitionist movement within the country will exist within northern states as well. Some within the North will also see slavery as illegal and immoral, that it violates moral codes of humans owning other humans. Also, one of the bases for having free states in the North was a manufacturing economy. Yes, there was agriculture in northern states, but it wasn't the same kind of agriculture happening in the South. It was based on high labor cash crop, where manufacturing also became the system of many northern cities. So the idea of factory owners not really wanting to own their employees, rather just paying them for the work they do and not really being concerned about what they do when they're not at work. So it was establishing a different kind of economy.
You mentioned that term cash crop. Do you guys remember what it is? Cash crop, pause this, think about it. Yes, you're absolutely correct. It is raising crops for money. And the most famous cash crop, Mr. Lawrence, was?
Cotton.
Cotton, absolutely. So let's go to the South. They tend to be pro-slavery. A majority of people living in the South tended to favor this. Again, they were based on an agricultural economy, growing those cash crops such as cotton, and slave labor was used on plantations. And the Southern economy is very dependent on slave labor. They do not have manufacturing like the North does. They hardly have any. And that is because most of their resources are tied up in slavery.
So again, ladies and gentlemen, this is just a broad generalization, as we've talked about before in class. Not everyone in the North was an abolitionist, and not everyone in the South was pro-slavery. But we're talking about broad ideas to study of American history. This tends to be how the divide happens.
Okay, let's talk about compromise. We have two compromises you should be familiar with. The first is the Missouri Compromise from 1820, and there are three different parts that you should know. Now, this applies to the Louisiana Purchase territory only. So over here in the green, and even the Arkansas and Louisiana area, this was when the United States purchased Louisiana in 1803. So there are three parts to this. The first one is that Missouri would enter the Union as a slave state. We see Missouri here in yellow. That becomes a state of the United States and is a slave state. Now, the North is concerned that the South will have an advantage of the number of slave states. So they decide to allow Maine to enter the Union as a free state. So over here we have Maine up here. So this keeps the balance of free and slave states equal. Now the 3630 latitude line is right here. Remember latitude from the beginning of the year. Everything above this 3630 line, all future states would be free, and everything below all future states would be slave. Now this only applies to the Louisiana Purchase territory. This area over here with Texas and the Mexican Cession area, the United States did not have in 1820. So the Compromise of 1850 will come along to deal with this area.
All right, so the Compromise of 1850, a little similar in some three parts, but also a little different because it's a little different. One thing, it brings in California as a free state. 1849, do you remember what happens in California, Mr. Norris?
Gold is discovered in the gold rush.
That's right, the 49ers. So we have the creation of a free California. But again, concerned about that balance. So what does the South get out of this? Well, we'll see. The Fugitive Slave Law will be passed, which allows bounty hunters to retrieve escaped slaves in the North. So it allows bounty hunters to go north and really take into custody anyone they felt was considered to be an escaped slave. And finally, popular sovereignty would be employed in order to give people the right to vote themselves to determine on the issue of slavery, if they were going to be added to the Union, would they be a free or slave state?
Okay, let's jump over to the road to the Civil War. We're going to go to the 1850s now. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, we saw this in the Division film, the Story of Us film, with John Brown kind of makes his name here. This act is a huge turning point in American history and helps lead to the Civil War. So what this does is it changes the Missouri Compromise. So it allows popular sovereignty, again, that idea of people to vote to determine if a state was free or slave. And the two states in particular were Kansas and Nebraska. Now, why this is an issue is because both of those states are above the 3630 line of the Missouri Compromise. So in effect, the Kansas-Nebraska Act reverses the Missouri Compromise.
So we can see maybe one of the few times in society where voting and really popular sovereignty or democracy itself could have a negative outcome. We saw this within Kansas because really politicians were at a point, as some politicians do today with certain issues, they give referendums where they let the people make the choice so they don't have to. And as a result, it leads to conflict between the anti and pro-slavery forces that meet in Kansas. So how does this lead to the start of the war? Well, rising tensions between northern and southern ideologies on slavery really for the first time start to turn violent in one section of the country.
Yeah, many historians will argue that Kansas was actually really the beginning of the Civil War. It was a mini Civil War in Kansas. So let's go to a very important court case, Dred Scott versus Sanford in 1857. This was when Dred Scott, seen here, sues for his freedom. He is a slave and he sued for his freedom. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that slaves were legally seen as property, not people. So Dred Scott couldn't even sue in court, they said. And as a result of being seen as property, he and other slaves had no protection under the law.
Very sad. Bad decision by the Supreme
Probably the
Court.
worst ever, I would say.
Absolutely. So the question, though, is how does this lead to war as well? Well, Southerners saw it as a victory to keep slavery alive, kind of being vindicated with the Constitution saying that slaves were not humans. They were seen really as property, and they were not given rights. Northerners feared that a continued spread of slavery would happen as we continued to move west and really just entrench or strengthen the institution of slavery in the United States.
Then we have John Brown, who I think is one of the most interesting people in history. He does a raid at Harpers Ferry, which is an armory. And you hear this term armory, it's a place where weapons are stored. Now, Harpers Ferry is the second largest armory in the United States. It is located in Virginia. So he had the idea that he was going to take over this armory, and slaves would then come and gather weapons and fight for freedom. The only problem is slaves don't know that he is at Harper's Ferry. So the significance of this event is that he captured a military arsenal in an attempt to spark a slave uprising through the South. And this is going to really scare a lot of Southerners.
Was he successful?
No, he was not.
All right, so then the question is, how was this lead to war if he wasn't successful? Well, it ultimately united many white Southerners in a fear of slave revolt. So it was more of a symbol that some people were willing to fight and die to bring an institution of slavery to an end. So this was a concern to many Southerners in power at the time.
Absolutely. And finally, we'll finish up with Abe Lincoln here. And look at he's beardless there. You don't see many beardless pics. He's looking very young. So in 1860, he is running for president. And his primary goal as president was to preserve the Union. It was not in the beginning to end slavery. It was to preserve the Union. And he gives a famous speech in which he says, "A house divided cannot stand."
All right, so what was Lincoln's views on slavery? Even though once he was going to be elected, he said he was not going to make it illegal. He did see it as immoral. There are writings and speeches of Lincoln who he felt that slavery was not an institution that should be supported, but also he felt that slavery should not spread. As president, he felt strongly that he would allow slavery to exist where it existed, but did not want to see it move any further.
Sounds a lot like the idea of containment we'll learn about during the Cold War.
Absolutely.
So how does this lead to the start of the war? Southern Democrats, which most of the South at this time were Democrats, they felt that the Republicans, led by Lincoln, would end slavery. So there was this fear that their livelihood was on the line with Lincoln being president. So this led to Southern secession and the creation of the Confederacy of the United States of America. And do you remember, Mr. Lawrence, what the first state was that seceded from the Union?
First state to decide to leave the Union was South Carolina.
South Carolina on December 20th of 1860. So shortly after the election, they said, we're out of here. We are no longer going to be a part of this country. All right, let's finish up with advantages and disadvantages
for the North and the South during this conflict. So again, the war starts in 1861. Mr. Norris, do you remember what considered the first official battle, first major shots fired during the war?
Fort Sumter on April 12th of 1861.
That's correct. So Confederate forces open up on a federal fort in Charleston Bay.
Mm-hmm.
So this action starts the Civil War, really kicking off the worst crisis the United States has ever faced. So there are advantages that both the North and the South had during this time period, and disadvantages. So for the North specifically, we see the North, because it becomes more industrialized at the time, has more transportation networks available, more railroads, which will be beneficial to move men and goods to the front during the actual conflict. Also, we see more men to fight. Some of the largest metropolitan areas, places like Boston, New York City, you will find within the Union. So they have a large pool of men to draw from. Also, more supplies, more materials. Because of industrialization, they can mass produce things like weapons, uniforms, all the basic necessities needed to fight a war. We see more money because, again, a wealthier area, more manufacturing, larger area as well. So this money will be beneficial in supporting a large military action. We see a naval superiority. With the Navy already existing under the Union, they'll be able to use it to help blockade parts of the South and really try to contain the South from getting more supplies, things needed from outside the Confederacy. And finally, political leadership. The one advantage the Union had at this time was a strong leader in Abraham Lincoln. Some people loved him, some people hated him, but he was still seen as that symbol representing the Union.
Definitely. And let's jump over to the South really quick. We have military leadership. People like Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were very well known for being excellent military leaders. They had a high morale. They believed that they were fighting for a important cause. The South believed they were fighting for an important cause. They also had home field advantage, that they knew the land better, and all they had to do was just keep the North from taking over. Basically, they just had to outlast the North in this war. All right, that is everything you need to know for video number 5 here. Please take a moment, flip to your video response sheet, and answer the following question. Why is the Civil War considered a constitutional crisis? And please do so in 3 sentences.